Hey besties, welcome back to Maggie Stories. What would you do if you see your pictures on a customer's wallet?
The thing about Sonia Williams was that she never did anything quietly. Not because she was trying to be dramatic, though she absolutely was sometimes, but because life simply refused to happen to her at a reasonable volume. Spilled coffee? Always in slow motion, always on something white, always in front of people. Missing the bus? Never by 5 seconds. Always by 1. Always while she was running, bags swinging, dignity already scattered somewhere on the sidewalk behind her. So when she walked into the university cafeteria on a Tuesday morning with a full tray of ramen and iced Americano, absolutely not watching where she was going because she was mid-argument with her phone calculator about whether she could afford both lunch and the silk scarf she'd seen in the window of the vintage shop on Hongdae Street, she should have known. She should have known. The collision happened the way all great catastrophes do, in complete, terrible slow motion. 1 second she was rounding the corner between the column and the vending machine, tray balanced with the confidence of someone who had never, not once in her life, dropped a tray, and the next second the world tilted. The ramen went first, a glorious aerial arc of broth and noodles, followed immediately by the iced Americano, which detonated on impact like it had been waiting for this exact moment its entire existence. The crash was tremendous. Every head in the cafeteria turned. Sonia stood frozen, tray now empty in her hands, mouth open, eyes wide, staring at the absolute disaster she had just committed upon a human person who had been standing there, quietly, inexplicably, in the exact spot she needed to be walking through. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered, and only because the ramen broth had splashed all the way up his chest, which was a long way up. He was tall and he was dressed in a shirt that clearly cost more than 3 of her paychecks stitched together, now soaked through with kimchi broth. He had sharp, clean features, the kind of face that looked like someone had drawn it deliberately, and black hair that now had one single ice cube resting on top of it, sitting there like a small, ridiculous crown. He hadn't moved. He hadn't yelled, hadn't flinched, hadn't grabbed napkins or looked at his shirt or done any of the things a normal human being would do after being catastrophically drenched with hot soup and iced coffee simultaneously. He was just looking at her, not with anger, not even with irritation, with something Sonia could not immediately name, which was unusual because she was very good at reading faces. His expression was quiet and still, and this was the part that would bother her for days afterward, almost relieved, like something he'd been waiting for had finally happened. The cafeteria held its breath. Sonia felt the collective tension of 200 students bracing for whatever came next, and she understood why. She'd heard about this guy in the vague peripheral way you hear about people who occupy a different social stratosphere. Rich, cold, the kind of person who made full professors straighten their posture when he walked in. She didn't know his name. She'd never needed to. She needed a plan. She needed an apology. She needed, ideally, for the floor to open and accept her into its depths. What she said instead was, "Okay, so, to be fair, you were standing in the corner." The boy with the ice cube on his head blinked, slowly. "That's a corner," Sonia continued, because apparently she had decided to commit to this. Corners are technically ambush zones. Any physics student will tell you. "You finally noticed me." His voice was low and even, not loud. He didn't raise it for the room. He said it like it was a simple fact, the same way you'd say it's raining or the train is late. Calm and unbothered, and somehow also the most confusing sentence Sonia had heard in her entire 23 years of life. She stared at him. "I'm sorry. I said you finally noticed me." He reached up and removed the ice cube from his hair with 2 fingers, examined it briefly, and set it on the nearest table with the energy of someone who did not find this strange at all. "I've been on the same campus as you for 2 semesters. Sonia blinked, then blinked again, then looked around the cafeteria, where 200 students were frozen in various stages of shock, waiting for her response. She looked back at him. "Sir," she said carefully, "I have never seen you before in my life." Something crossed his face. Not hurt, exactly. More like the quiet acknowledgement of a fact he already knew and had long since made his peace with. He picked up his bag from where it had somehow avoided the disaster. He looked at her once more. That same strange, steady look that she couldn't quite categorize, and said, "I know." Then he walked away. The entire cafeteria exhaled. Sonia stood in the wreckage of her lunch, empty tray in hand, surrounded by broth and ice cubes and the accumulated stares of everyone who had witnessed this interaction, and felt the very specific, deeply uncomfortable sensation of not understanding something that felt like it should be simple. "Bestie," said a girl at the nearest table. Slowly. "What just happened?" "I don't know," Sonia said honestly. She didn't know. But she would think about it all the way home. She would think about it on the bus. She would think about it while restocking the chip aisle at the convenience store at 9 p.m. in her white uniform shirt and the gold earrings she refused to take off even at work because aesthetics were non-negotiable. She would replay the moment over and over, the ramen, the ice cube, the expression on his face, and she would keep arriving at the same impossible conclusion. He hadn't been surprised to see her. He'd been waiting. The universe, as it turned out, had opinions about Sonia minding her own business. She saw him again. The very next morning. Same bus. Bus 273, the early 7:15 that smelled like convenience store coffee and quiet suffering. Sonia got on at Mapo Station with her tote bag and her thermal cup and her noise-canceling headphones, found a seat near the window, and had approximately 40 seconds of peace before she looked up and saw him, standing at the back, holding the rail, dressed like he'd walked out of a magazine and was now, inexplicably, taking the 7:15 bus with students and office workers and one elderly man with a very loud radio. His eyes were already on her. Sonia's stomach did something she immediately refused to acknowledge. She put her headphones back on and looked out the window with the specific intensity of someone who was absolutely not thinking about anything. She saw him at the library on Thursday. Not at the same table, that would have been too obvious. No, he was 3 rows over, reading something dense-looking in a reading chair, positioned in a way that was technically just a person sitting in a library. He didn't look at her. He was simply there, in the same space, occupying the same air, existing in her peripheral vision like a splinter she couldn't locate. She saw him on Friday at the Pojamika 2 blocks from her apartment, which didn't even make sense geographically because she'd chosen that particular Pojamika specifically because it was far from campus. He was sitting at the end of the street cart, eating tegbaki alone, and he didn't look up when she walked past. But she had the absolute, bone-certain feeling that he'd known she was there before she turned the corner. On Saturday, she was telling herself she was imagining it. By Sunday evening, she was not telling herself that anymore. She was standing at the register of the GS25 where she worked 3 nights a week, wearing her white uniform polo over a black fitted turtleneck. Just because the uniform was required didn't mean she couldn't make it work, and she had just finished the internal monologue she'd been having all week, which concluded, "You are a normal person and you are imagining things and coincidences exist." And then the door opened. She didn't look up immediately, because she was ringing up a customer's ramen and banana milk. She heard the footsteps. She finished the transaction, gave the change, said her practice de oseo, with exactly the right brightness and then looked at the door. He was standing in the snack aisle, reading the back of a chip bag. "Okay," Sonia said out loud. The customer she'd just served turned around. The one other patron in the store, a middle-aged man buying cigarettes, paused. Sonia leaned on the counter, pointed directly at the tall, inexplicably present man in her snack aisle, and said at full volume, You have been everywhere. Explain." He looked up from the chip bag. His expression didn't change. "I like this store." "You like this store. Good inventory." "Sir," Sonia said, with the measured tone of someone exercising great restraint, "I have seen you on my bus, at my library, at the Pojamika near my apartment, and now at my job at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night. Either you are the most accidentally present person in Seoul or something is happening, and I need you to tell me what." He set the chip bag down. He walked to the counter, and up close, in the flat fluorescent light of the convenience store. He was somehow even more unfairly structured than she remembered. Sharp jaw, serious eyes, the kind of resting face that made people uncomfortable. He put both hands on the counter and looked at her steadily and said, "I'm buying snacks." "You?" Sonia closed her mouth, opened it. "That is not an answer." "It is, technically." "It is not." She stopped, breathed, looked at him. "What's your name?" A pause. Something very small moved in his face. Something that might, on anyone else, have been the beginning of a smile. "Jean Woo," he said. "Cha Jean Woo." "Sonia," she said, because she was not going to let him have the upper hand in her own store. "And I feel like you already knew that." He held her gaze. "I did." She stared at him. He looked back at her, completely unruffled, as if confessing that he already knew the name of someone he'd apparently just met was a completely ordinary thing to say. "That's supposed to make me feel better?" she demanded. "I didn't say it to make you feel better," Jinwoo said. "You asked me a direct question. I gave you a direct answer." Sonia pointed at him. "You're going to explain yourself. Tonight, or next time I see you, and I will see you again apparently because you're everywhere. I'm gonna make it a whole thing." Loudly. "I know," he said. He bought the chips. He paid in exact change. He said "Anyongi Jaisio" very quietly on his way out, and then he was gone, and Sonia stood at the counter alone in the yellow light of the convenience store with the completely irrational feeling that something had just begun. Something she didn't have a word for yet and wasn't sure she wanted one. She looked at the door for a long time after he left. Outside, the street was quiet. The kind of soul quiet that only happened after 10. When the noise finally compressed itself into something softer. A motorbike somewhere. Rain starting, slow and indifferent, against the window. She hadn't asked how he knew her name. She had assumed, and she was almost certain she was right. But the question that would actually keep her up that night wasn't how he knew her name. It was the thing he'd said on Tuesday in the cafeteria, with broth on his shirt and an ice cube in his hair and 200 people watching. "You finally noticed me. Finally." Like he had been waiting. Like he had been patient. Like she was the last one to understand something everyone else had long since accepted. She wiped down the counter, restocked the banana milk, told herself, firmly and out loud to the empty store, that she was not curious. She was very, very curious. 3 weeks later, Sonia had a system. The system was, pretend everything was normal. It was not, she acknowledged privately, a particularly sophisticated system. But it had the advantage of requiring very little from her emotionally, which was valuable because Cha Jinwoo was apparently now a permanent feature of her daily landscape. And if she thought about it too hard, it started to feel like something she didn't have a category for. He was on her bus every Tuesday and Thursday. Always at the back. Never in the same seat, which meant he wasn't holding it as his spot. He was just getting on after her and finding wherever was close without being too close, which was a level of calculated distance that she found profoundly irritating because it meant he was thinking about it. He was in the library on Wednesday afternoons in the reading section, 3 rows from wherever she sat. He never approached her there. Never spoke. Sometimes when she looked up she caught him reading and sometimes, not always, but sometimes with a frequency she was absolutely not tracking. She caught him already looking at her and then looking back down at his book without any apparent embarrassment at being caught, which was somehow worse. He came into the GS25 at least twice a week. Always between 8:30 and 10 p.m. during her shift. He bought things. He paid. He said exactly as many words as were necessary and sometimes fewer. Once he put a pack of banana milk on the counter and she looked at it and said, "I don't even like banana milk." And he said, "I know. It's for me." And she had absolutely no response to that because of course it was for him. He was buying it. She had just been startled into assuming things. The problem with Jinwoo, the central structural problem, was that he never did anything wrong. That was it. That was the whole problem. Because if he had done something wrong, Sonia would have had a direction to point her feelings. She would have been able to say, that is the problem, I have identified it. But he didn't loom. He didn't follow her in a way that felt threatening. He didn't push or crowd or make her feel cornered. He was just present, consistently and without drama, in the outer orbit of her life. Like a quiet planet she hadn't known was there and now couldn't stop noticing because once you see something you cannot unsee it. She complained about him constantly to herself and to the universe and once to the GS25 shop cat, whose name was Dalgona and who was completely unsympathetic. She also, and this part she reported to no one, started noticing things. Small things. Things that didn't mean anything and probably had explanations. Like, the week she'd had 3 back-to-back exams and had been surviving on spite and vending machine coffee. Someone left a brown paper bag on her desk at the library. Inside, 1 triangle kimbap, 1 can of peach juice, and a small sticky note that said, in very neat handwriting, "You've been here 6 hours. No name." Like, the time she was leaving the store at 10:45 on a rainy Thursday night and found a compact umbrella she'd never seen before sitting on top of her bag in the back room. And when she asked Mrs. Cho, the owner, Mrs. Cho said vaguely that a customer had asked her to pass it along. And when Sonia asked which customer, Mrs. Cho just said, "The tall, quiet one," and went back to her drama. Like the chip he'd been reading the label on the night she confronted him. She'd looked for it 3 days later, and it was already the most expensive snack in the store, and it was fully restocked, a whole new box of it, when before they'd only ever kept 4 bags. These were coincidences. They were probably coincidences. Sonia was choosing to believe in coincidences. It was raining the night everything changed. A proper November rain. Not the polite misting Seoul did in October, but the real kind, thick and cold and completely indifferent to the fact that Sonia had just had a 12-hour day that included a group presentation, a register malfunction, and one customer who had argued with her for 9 minutes about a coupon that explicitly said it expired in September. She was restocking the hot drink section, which was near the window, and she could hear the rain hammering the awning outside. The store was quiet. Mrs. Cho had gone home early. It was just Sonia and Dalgona, who was asleep on the newspaper shelf and not useful to anyone. The door opened at 9:47 p.m. She didn't look up. Annyeonghaseyo. Footsteps. The usual place, the snack aisle. She restocked, rotated the cans. Did the thing she did when he was in the store, where she held a completely normal and professional customer service posture and absolutely did not track his position by sound, which she was currently doing. He came to the counter at 9:52. Small bottle of green tea. Pack of chestnut crackers. He set them down and reached into his coat for his wallet. Long black leather wallet, worn at the edges in a way that seemed at odds with everything else about him, and the wallet slipped. It hit the linoleum and fell open. And Sonia reached down to pick it up at the exact same moment Jinwoo did, and she got there first because she was already leaning on the counter and her reach was shorter, and she straightened up with it in her hand and glanced down automatically, the way you do just to check if anything had fallen out. She froze. Her brain registered what she was looking at, one image at a time, like pages in a book that wouldn't quite turn fast enough. Photo 1, a school ID. Younger face, same sharp jaw, same dark eyes. Her own name handwritten on a small paper clip tag. No, wait, that wasn't his ID. That was her name. On his wallet. She looked again. Behind the ID slot, behind the card stack, in the little accordion of photo sleeves that old-style wallets had. Photos. Not random photos. Her photos. One was her university ID photo, the official one, the one that was in the school system, taken at orientation, where she'd worn a black blazer and put her earrings in specifically because she was not going to have a bad ID photo, not ever. That photo should exist in exactly one place. The university database. One was a candid shot of her outside the GS25, taken from across the street, her in her uniform and the gold earrings, looking at her phone, completely unaware. The photo was slightly creased at the corner, like it had been handled many times. One was, she turned the sleeve slightly and her stomach dropped. A photo of her at a pojangmaka. She remembered that night. She'd gone with university friends after midterms. That had been months ago, before she'd ever exchanged a single word with this man. And she was sitting there laughing at something with her head thrown back and her hand on the table, and the photo had been taken from outside the tent. There was a fourth one. The fourth one was older. The paper was different, thinner, slightly faded. A child's photo, clearly printed from some kind of small printer. She squinted. It took her a moment to recognize the school uniform because it had been years, and she'd only worn that uniform for 1 year, the year her family had been in Seoul the first time, when she'd been 12 and terrified and utterly lost in a new school and a new language. She looked up. Jinwoo was looking at her. He had gone very still. His hand was still extended from when he'd been reaching for the wallet, suspended in the air between them. The rain was very loud on the roof. Sonia opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She looked at the wallet. She looked at him. "How many?" she said. Her voice came out strangely flat, which was very unlike her. "How many photos are in here?" A pause. "7, Jinwoo said. 7. The number 7. "I know what 7 means," Sonia said, and then immediately checked herself and lowered her voice, because there were 2 other customers in the store and Dalgona had woken up on the newspaper shelf and was staring at her. She looked back at Jinwoo, who had lowered his hand and was watching her with an expression of careful, guarded calm. "You have 7 photos of me in your wallet." "Yes. Photos of me that I did not give you." "Correct. Including one from what appears to be a school I attended 11 years ago." "Yes. I need you," Sonia said very slowly, "to explain this to me in full, clear sentences, starting from the very beginning, because I am holding a lot right now and the specific part of my brain that handles weird information is at capacity." Jin-woo looked at the wallet, looked at her, and then said, with the absolute composure of someone who had apparently rehearsed for this moment or had simply given up on ever seeming normal. Before you scream, I'm not screaming. Some of those are limited edition. Sonia stared at him. The school photo, he continued, the faintest shift in his expression suggesting he understood this wasn't helping him but couldn't quite stop, was taken with a film camera. The development quality is quite good for Jin-woo. Her voice had gone very quiet. Quiet was always more dangerous than loud with Sonia, and something in his face registered this. I am a black woman standing alone in a convenience store holding a wallet that contains 7 photographs of me that you collected without my knowledge. I need you to understand the specific flavor of unhinged this currently is before you continue talking about photo quality. Silence. The rain. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he took a slow breath and said, "Can I explain? Please." "Not here." She looked at him. He looked back, and for once his expression wasn't carefully blank. There was something in it, something under the surface, something she couldn't quite see but could feel the shape of. Something that was not threatening and was not casual and was not the look of someone who thought what he'd done was nothing. It was the look of someone who had been carrying something for a very long time. "When?" she said. "Whenever you're comfortable." "That's not an answer." "Tomorrow," he said. "There's a cafe on Yonseiaro, the one with the blue door. I'll be there at 2 if you come." He held out his hand for the wallet. Sonia looked at it, looked at him, made a decision she couldn't entirely justify to herself. Held it out. His fingers closed around it and for just a second, 1 second, the side of his hand brushed hers, and she had the strangest sensation, a flash of something almost like recognition, like a word you know but can't quite locate. He paid for his green tea and crackers. He put his hood up. He walked to the door. "Jin-woo," she said. He stopped. "If you don't explain everything tomorrow," she said, "I will dedicate actual energy to making your life loud and inconvenient." "I know," he said, and then he was gone into the rain. Sonia stood at the counter for a long moment, looking at the door, the rain blurring everything on the other side into soft impressionist shapes, and she tried to locate the feeling in her chest and categorize it. She couldn't. It wasn't fear. It wasn't exactly anger. It was something closer to standing at the edge of a very large revelation, knowing the ground was about to shift, not yet knowing in which direction. She looked down at the register. 7 photos. 7. One of her at 12 years old, in a school she tried not to think about because that year had been hard, in a uniform she'd been bullied in for the first 2 months before she'd figured out how to survive, and she had been so lonely that year that she'd eaten lunch alone for most of the semester. Sonia stopped. She felt something move, slow and deep, in the back of her memory. A thread she hadn't touched in years. There was a corner of a classroom. A lunchbox shared without words. A small boy with careful eyes who'd sat across from her one day and said nothing and had given her half his rice without making it a big deal. And she had been so grateful she hadn't even cried. She'd never learned his name. She'd moved back to the States 4 months later, and she'd been 13, and she'd left that year behind as completely as she could because it had been hard and she'd been alone and she didn't like looking at it. Her eyes were back on the door. The rain. The soft, dark shape of soul through the glass. "No," Sonia said, out loud, to the empty store, to Dalgona, to herself. "No, it's not." But her hands were already slightly unsteady, and she knew. The way you know things that your brain hasn't finished confirming yet. That tomorrow at 2 o'clock, everything was going to be different. She almost didn't go. She stood in front of her closet at 12:30 p.m. the next day and had a serious internal argument with herself about whether showing up was capitulating. Whether it was okay to be curious about someone who had been quietly, methodically collecting her image for apparently 11 years. Whether the fact that she'd barely slept and had replayed the rain and the wallet and the brief press of his fingers against hers too many times was a sign she should stay home. She put on wide-leg black trousers, a deep wine-colored knit top, and her white sneakers, and was out the door by 1:15. She told herself it was because she needed answers. This was partially true. The other part she refused to examine. The cafe with the blue door was one of those sole places that seemed to exist slightly outside of time. Low ceilings, warm amber lighting, shelves of old books that were actually used and not decorative, jazz playing at a volume that felt like weather. It smelled like roasted barley and cinnamon and coffee beans that had been stored properly. Jin-woo was already there. Of course he was already there. He was sitting at the back corner table, both hands around a mug, looking at nothing in particular. He was wearing a dark gray sweater and his hair was slightly different from usual. Less arranged, more like he'd let it do what it wanted. He looked like a person instead of a carefully constructed concept, which Sonia found immediately suspicious. She slid into the seat across from him and put her bag on the chair beside her and looked at him and said, "Start talking." He looked at her. Some of the careful composure from last night was still there, but it was thinner, like a coat worn in the wrong weather. "How much do you remember?" he said. "About the year you were 12? Sonia felt the thing in her chest tighten. "Enough," she said carefully. "Do you remember Yongdongpo Elementary?" Not a question. He knew. She held his gaze. "Yes. Second semester," he said. "You started in March." "Yes. You had a desk near the window. You always had headphones in before class started. You had a bag with a patch on it. Something from an American cartoon." "How?" She stopped. Started again. "You were there." "I was there," he said. Silence. "I was 9, he said. "I had skipped a grade. I was the youngest in the class and the smallest and I had—" A brief pause, something tightening in his jaw. "A difficult time with some of the other students. I ate lunch alone because it was simpler than what happened when I didn't." Sonia felt something go very quiet inside her. "You came in March," he continued, voice steady but careful. "The way you carry something fragile. You didn't know anyone. You didn't know much Korean. You sat by yourself and you had—" Something shifted in his expression. Something warmer and more unguarded than she'd seen from him. Absolutely enormous energy for someone who was also clearly terrified. "You would come in every morning and you'd look at the room like you were deciding whether to conquer it or burn it down. I found it fascinating." "Jin-woo. You sat across from me at lunch on the 14th day," he said. "I counted." Afterward. A pause. "You pointed at my lunchbox and said something in English, and when I didn't understand you, you pointed at yourself and said Sonia very loudly, like volume would fix the language barrier." Sonia made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "I gave you half my rice because you'd forgotten your lunch again. It was the 3rd time that week. You bowed very formally and said Gamsahamnida with the worst accent I'd ever heard and ate the whole thing in about 4 minutes. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. "We didn't talk much," he said. "We didn't have the vocabulary between us. But you sat across from me every day after that. And some of the other students, the ones who had given me problems, they didn't come near when you were there. Not because you were intimidating, necessarily. Just because—" He looked at her for a moment, honest and open in a way she wasn't accustomed to seeing from him. "Because you were so fully yourself that it made them feel small, and they knew it, and they left." "I didn't do that on purpose," she said softly. "I didn't even notice." "I know. That's what made it." He stopped, chose his words with care. "Significant." The jazz played. Someone in the front of the cafe laughed at something. "You left in June," Jin-woo said. "One day you were there and the next day you weren't. And I found out from the teacher that your family had returned to America. You didn't get to say goodbye. I don't think you knew you were leaving until it happened." "I didn't," she said. "My dad got a call at the end of May. We were packed by the 2nd week of June." He nodded, like he'd suspected. "I thought about you occasionally," he said. "In the way you think about people who mattered briefly and completely and then disappeared. Then I went to secondary school and I didn't think about you for a few years." He turned his mug slowly on the table. "When I was 15, my father moved the family to a second residence, and I was going through old things from the Yongdongpo apartment and I found a class photo. You were in it. 2nd row from the back, half smiling like you hadn't quite decided whether to commit to it." Sonia remembered that photo. She had one copy. Somewhere. In a box somewhere in her mother's house. "I don't know how to explain what happened next in a way that doesn't sound concerning," Sonia offered. The corner of his mouth moved. It was extremely small. Counted. "I was going to say unusual. Those are the same word. I found the photo and I kept it," he said. "Because I was 15 and I had a memory attached to it that I didn't want to lose. That was all, at first. Then a few years later I was at university here and I was walking across the quad and I saw a girl. With the exact energy of someone who was deciding whether to conquer or burn. And I—" He stopped. It was you, he said. Sonia realized she wasn't breathing quite normally. You had your headphones in, he said, and you were eating a triangle kimbap walking and talking to yourself and your bag had a different patch on it, but you still bowed to the bus driver, and he exhaled once, slow. I knew. I knew it was you before I was close enough to see your face. And you didn't come say hello? She meant it to sound accusatory because she was still partially processing the fact that this man had photos of her in his wallet, but it came out more genuinely confused. Jin-woo looked at her steadily. You didn't know me, he said. To you I would have been a stranger walking up to you on a university quad saying I know you, we shared a lunchbox when we were 9. That didn't seem like something you would respond well to. Sonia opened her mouth, closed it. That's actually fair. So I didn't approach. He looked down at his mug. I just made sure I could see you were okay. That is the description of surveillance, Jin-woo. It was concern. These are legally distinct but emotionally quite close. Sonia. He said her name simply, not to stop her, just to acknowledge her. I know how it sounds. I'm not telling you it was rational. I'm telling you what it was. He looked at her again. You were the only person in my memory who had ever simply sat across from me and shared a space without wanting anything from it. You were 9. I was 9. There was nothing complicated about it. You were kind in the most unceremonious way I'd ever seen. And you didn't even know you were being kind because you weren't performing anything. You were just being, loudly and honestly, the way you do everything. He stopped himself. Sonia felt a warmth in her chest that she was going to need a moment with privately later. The photos, she said. The first one I took, he said, was because I wanted to remember that you were real. That's the one from outside the GS25. That was almost a year ago, and I took exactly one, and I've debated with myself about whether it was acceptable every day since. He paused. It wasn't acceptable. I understand that. The other candid ones I'm not going to pretend were appropriate. The school ID photo was obtained through another pause. Means I'm choosing not to detail, which means it was technical and slightly illegal and I'm aware. Slightly illegal, Sonia repeated. Borderline. Jin-woo. I know. She looked at him. He looked back at her. The lamp on the table made everything amber and soft and slightly unreal. And the limited edition comment last night, she said. Something in him settled. The school photo is the only one that can't be reprinted. The others technically. I'm going to stop you there, Sonia said. He stopped. Sonia sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way she did when she was assembling her thoughts in the correct order. Then she looked back at him. Okay, she said. Here is where I am. I am going to be honest because that is something I do. She ticked on her fingers. First, you should not have taken photos of me without my knowledge. That was wrong. You know it was wrong. We are going to keep knowing that. Agreed. Second, what you just told me about being 9 years old and eating alone and the class photo, that I understand. That I actually understand because that year was hard for me too and you were one of the only things in it that was kind. And I didn't know your name and I left without saying goodbye and I think about that sometimes. Something moved through his face like light through a window. Third, she said, and her voice had gentled slightly against her intentions. You have apparently spent years conducting what I can only describe as a long-distance friendship with me that I was not aware I was participating in, which is chaotic and unhinged, and yet somehow the least threatening thing I've ever heard, which I would like the record to show says something very specific about how you've conducted yourself. Jin-woo was quiet. He was looking at her with something in his expression that was open and careful and waiting. I'm not afraid of you, Sonia said. I want to make that clear. I'm choosing to be here. I could have not come. I know, he said, but I need the photos to stop. The collecting. All of it. Yes. And you need to say actual things to me going forward instead of just appearing in places and buying snacks like a cryptid with excellent taste in crackers. Something happened to Jinwoo's face that she had never seen before. It happened slowly and he seemed to barely be aware of it. A quiet unwinding, something releasing that had been held for a very long time. The corner of his mouth moved. And this time it wasn't the small controlled half movement she'd seen before. This was actual. Warm. Human in a way that made her chest do the thing she was not examining. I can do that, he said. Good, Sonia said, and picked up the menu because she was going to order something, and used the act of ordering as a moment to regulate her face. And I'm keeping the umbrella. That was a gift. I know. I'm keeping it. She looked at the menu. Looked up. Also for the record, my Korean is perfect now, so if you sat across from me today there would be no language problem. The warmth in his face shifted into something quieter and more honest and slightly devastating. I know, he said. I've noticed. She looked at her menu. He looked at her. Outside, the sky was doing that thing Seoul skies did in November, gray and full and not quite raining yet, holding something, waiting. And in the amber light of a cafe with a blue door, 11 years and 7 photographs, and one shared lunchbox finally, quietly, closed the distance they'd kept between them, and began something new.
Hey besties, in this story we learned that Sonia spent years being the girl nobody saw coming. Turns out somebody had been seeing her all along. Some people don't announce themselves, they just stay quietly, consistently, until you finally look up and realize they were never a stranger at all. Besties, do you all want episode 2? Because this story is only getting started.